The economic life of Montgomery was centered around the Maxwell and Gunter Air Force bases. During the year 1955, these two bases channeled a total of $58 million into the Montgomery business economy. 1 out of every 14 people who were employed in Montgomery worked at one of these two bases. Also, 1 out of every 7 families was an Air Force family. While the city of Montgomery was completely segregated, these two Air Force bases were in fact integrated. There was a lack of industry work available in Montgomery at the time. This led to 63% of African American women being domestic workers, while 48% of African American men were either laborers or domestic workers themselves. The income was quite different between the white people and African American people. In 1950, the median income for 70,000 whites was $1,730. However, for the 50,000 African Americans, the median income was just $970. This discrepancy of income was seen by the way whites and African Americans lived and the luxuries that they could afford. 94% of white families had flush toilets, while only 31% of blacks were able to enjoy the same luxury. African Americans did not have much of a say at all in the terms of politics. Only about 10% of the African American population was registered to vote. In 1954, about 30,000 African Americans were of legal voting age. However, only about 2,000 were registered to vote. This lack of African American voters was due partly to their lack of interest, but also due to the barriers they believed were set up against them. There was a separate line for African Americans to register to vote. This line took much more time to get through than the line for the white voters. If there were 50 people in the line, the registrar might get to about 15 of them by the end of the day. Also, there were no African Americans represented in either the city or county offices. A couple of months after Martin Luther King Jr. arrived in Montgomery, 15-year-old Claudette Colvin was arrested and jailed for refusing to give up her bus seat for a white passenger. There was talk of boycotting the buses after this incident. The police commissioner and the city attorney said that action would be taken, but nothing transpired. However, this event created a sense of courage and self-respect among the African American community. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested after also refusing to give up her seat. After this event, E.D. Nixon and influential women of the Montgomery community came to an agreement to start a bus boycott. The next day, December 2nd, Nixon called Martin Luther King Jr. to discuss the boycott. Nixon also discussed the boycott with Reverend Ralph Abernathy, who felt that the boycott was necessary. Abernathy was said to be Martin Luther King Jr.'s closest associate and most trusted friend. A meeting was called to discuss the boycott. E.D. Nixon was not able to attend the meeting, so Reverend L. Roy Bennett, who was president of the Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance, presided over the meeting. The unanimous sense of the group was to go through with a bus boycott. A citywide meeting was called for December 5th to determine how long to boycott at the Holt Street Baptist Church. Reverend W.J. Powell was appointed to work on the taxi companies. The plan was to contact the 18 different African American taxi companies who had 210 taxis in their control and request that they offer the same 10-cent bus fare for their rides. The taxis agreed. The first day of the boycott, there was almost 100% participation. The community decided to form an ad hoc organization to direct the protest. Martin Luther King Jr. was elected the president, Reverend L. Roy Bennett was elected the vice president, and E.D. Nixon was elected as the treasurer. They decided to call this organization the Montgomery Improvement Association, also referred to as the MIA. There was discussion about keeping this organization and their acts a secret. E.D. Nixon said they must go public, which would give the community new heart. Ralph Abernathy was tasked with coming up with the demands for the protest. They were as follows: courteous treatment guaranteed by bus operators, passengers being greeted on a first-come, first-served basis, with African Americans loading from back to front, while whites were seated from the front to the back, and to hire African American bus drivers on predominantly black routes. There was also a finance committee created, due to the fact that 17,500 blacks would have to walk at least a little due to the protest. Police Commissioner Sellers declared that the tax companies must comply with the law and charge at least 45 cents for a ride. The MIA started a private carpool, which grew to 300 cars. They had a dispatch and a pickup station set up to accommodate the riders. The cost of running the MIA grew to $5,000 a month. Press coverage of what was going on in Montgomery spread around the world, and the MIA would receive a total of $250,000 in donations. The City Fathers of Montgomery held a meeting with the MIA. They discussed the 3 demands the MIA wished to reach. The MIA stressed that the new seating arrangements they sought would coincide with the segregation law, since the same arrangements are used in Nashville, Mobile, and Atlanta. But Jack Crenshaw, an attorney for the bus company, said they would be violating city ordinance. Commissioner Parks said that this arrangement could be worked into segregation laws, but was shot down by Crenshaw and sided with him. Crenshaw said that the bus operators would be courteous, but the seating arrangements would not change and they would hire no African Americans. The mayor called a citizens' meeting on December 17th. The MIA changed their stance on hiring black bus drivers to simply accepting their applications. C.K. Totten from the National City Lines, who came down from Chicago, took the same stance as Crenshaw. After the meeting, Totten tells Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. his plan would work, but the commission would not accept it. On January 22nd, a group of prominent African American ministers allegedly worked out a settlement. The MIA had no knowledge of this, and the settlement did not benefit them in any way. The police then proceeded to use a get tough policy where they began to arrest African Americans for minor or made-up traffic violations. This was used to counter the carpool the blacks were using. During this time, Martin Luther King Jr. received threatening phone calls, and his house was bombed. The nonviolent protest was so close to becoming violent. 2 nights later, dynamite was set off on E.D. Nixon's lawn. The protest still went on as a nonviolent protest. King stressed that violence in protest was both impractical and immoral. On January 9th, an old state law was brought up that read, Title 14, Section 54. If 2 or more people enter into a conspiracy to prevent operation of a lawful business without just cause or legal excuse, it is determined to be a misdemeanor. Following this, mass arrests were made. On February 13th, a jury, which was made up of 17 white people and only 1 African American, found the boycott to be illegal. After this, many African Americans voluntarily went to the police station to see if their name was on the list and get arrested. Martin Luther King Jr. decided to cut his businesses short and return to Montgomery upon hearing this. He went to the police station and he himself was arrested. He had trial on March 19th and was found guilty and faced a $500 fine or 386 days hard labor in Montgomery. On May 11, 1956, there was a federal hearing to determine if the bus segregation in Montgomery was constitutional. On June 4th, the court ruled the bus segregation laws in Montgomery to be unconstitutional. On November 14th, the MIA met to determine if they should end the protest. Since the ruling would take a while to enforce, they decided to keep on with the protest for a little while longer until the law went into full effect.